you very much, Mr. Speaker. Before I start my speech, I'd like to take the time to explain why a member from Abitibi-Témiscamingue in northern Quebec would want to rise to speak about the situation in Ukraine. I'll start by talking a little bit about history. In the First World War, it began, we were allied with Great Britain, so at a certain time, we ordered the internment of enemies of the state. And that included people from Germany and people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And 4 internment camps were created in Canada, 4 in Quebec, and the first to open was at Spirit Lake, which was in a small village near my riding. It was in a location that was strategic from an internment point of view, because at the time in 1915, when the internment camp was opened, about the only thing that existed in the area was the railway. So these people were in the middle of nowhere, in a deserted forest, in the middle of winter, and the only thing that was there before was the railway. So roughly 1,200 prisoners spent time in that camp between 1915 and 1917, and the vast majority of them were Ukrainian. There were civilians and soldiers who worked there. Over 50 buildings were built over a 2-square-kilometer area, and 22 people died in that internment camp, and 19 of them are interred in a cemetery in the region. And so that's why it's important for me to explain why there is a Ukrainian population in Abitibi-Témiscamingue. And the camp at Spirit Lake was reopened not too long ago, and the Minister of Skills and Social Development was there, as well as the Parliamentary Secretary for Defense, the member for Etobicoke Lakeshore, was there to speak to the events that took place there. There was a second wave of immigration in my riding at the close of the Second World War. Immigrants from Eastern Europe arrived in my riding to work in the mines and to work in the foundries. And that wave of immigration included people from Ukraine. And there are several buildings which were dedicated to the Ukrainian community. And a number of members of the Ukrainian community established themselves in my riding. Certain people changed their names, took the last part of their last name off so that their names sounded more French-Canadian. So if we look, we will find that there are members of the Ukrainian community who have been in Abitibi since its creation. Abitibi will celebrate its centenary in 2014. So immigration from Ukraine to Abitibi began at the start of our history. So I wanted to take this moment to explain this history, and members of the Ukrainian community in my riding remain very close to Ukraine, and that's why I was very happy to be selected by the Department of Foreign Affairs with my colleague from Etobicoke Centre to highlight the anniversary of the Holodomor. My colleague from Etobicoke Centre and I were supposed to take part in those ceremonies, and as I'll remind the House, the Holodomor was an event that took place between 1932 and 1933, where millions of Ukrainians were starved by the Soviet regime. Many Ukrainians died. It's a very sad moment in the history of Ukraine. And given the Ukrainian presence in my riding, it was very important for me to be present at that event, and my colleague and I were supposed to leave November 21st, and a few minutes before we were supposed to leave, we were told not to leave, not to travel, because of what had happened. I'll remind you that on November the 21st, the government of Ukraine decided to not sign the agreement with the European Union, and that set off the first wave of protests which were repressed by violent means by the police in Ukraine. And so, given that situation, we were not present in Kiev for that commemoration. And since that time, violence has continued in Ukraine. The protesters are peaceful. What they want is a new presidential election. They'd like to have real democratic presidential elections. And there are people from my community who are particularly touched by this. Jim Slobodian, for example, who worked for years to open the Spirit Lake camp to visitors. And Mr. Slobodian says that his father, who arrived in Canada nearly 100 years ago, left Ukraine because they did not wish to continue to be treated in a repressive way. So this situation is affecting people in my riding, people who are very concerned by the current situation. Also, Lebeyev Shklyakov, who founded the Ukrainian churches in Val d'Orne, Rouen, Noranda 60 years ago, has spoken about this crisis. And he says that he hopes that events will be positive for Ukraine and for the European Union. He also hopes that President Yanukovych will leave, that there will be free and fair elections in Ukraine. And he's also afraid of what the Russian government might do. He's worried that the Russian government may be attempting to create a new empire. He says that it's important to the Russians that Ukraine ally with them, not just for commercial reasons, but because, as he fears, they're trying to build a new empire. So this is a situation that people are very concerned about. And these are just some of the things that Ukrainian immigrants and descendants of Ukrainian immigrants have been telling me. They want to be proud of their country. They want to see the pacific demonstrations continue. And with all the links between Ukraine and my riding, what people in my riding hope is that Canada will use its position to play a leading role to do everything it can for democracy in Ukraine. I think that we can play a major role in this conflict. And I hope that we'll be able to see a quick end to this situation, because people are dying. Young people roughly my age have died in this conflict. And that's something that's particularly troubling. These are people who want democracy, they want freedom, and they've been killed for that reason. And the situation is even more troubling. We're afraid that there will be a new wave of violence. We hope that that won't be the case, but we don't want to see these protesters further repressed. We don't want to see more young people lose their lives in these protests. So I feel that it's very important that Canada use its position to play a leadership role to help Ukraine find solutions and to bring democracy back to Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions, comments. Question and commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened closely to my colleague from Abitibi's speech, and I did have the opportunity to be there for the opening of the Spirit Lake camp. It allows us to remember a very sad moment in this country's history when Ukrainians were interred during the First World War. We must never forget that. Now we're in 2014, and here we're talking about the leadership role that Canada could play to bring about an end to this sad situation in Ukraine. And I'd like to ask my colleague, could she please explain what measures we could take as Canadians, working together with our colleagues in other countries who share our desire and our will to see freedom and democracy in Ukraine? What can we do working with our allies and with countries that share our hopes and that share the hopes of Ukrainians? In a concrete manner, what can we do to help Ukrainians? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that, first of all, we should use our diplomatic strength to take measures against the President of Ukraine. Canada should also, in my opinion, explore the possibility of imposing sanctions on those responsible, or, for example, that we should freeze the assets of those responsible for this situation. And I believe there are other measures that could be taken, but I believe that we need to be firm, but that we need to use diplomatic channels, and that we should use the political power and the strength of Ukrainians in Canada.
The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is in relation to, I guess, the former question that was just asked, when the member made reference to what could we do with other countries around the world. My question is more so specific in terms of Canada does have a strong leadership role that it could play, even if it means going alone. And I think that many Canadians would agree that Canada is positioned strong enough that, in fact, it could take targeted sanctions, that we don't have to wait for other countries in order to take such sanctions. And my question to the member is, to what degree does she believe, and it's been suggested, the member from Wascana back in December made it very clear that targeted sanctions, Canada could go alone on those targeted sanctions if need be, and we should be taking those targeted sanctions. We don't have to wait for countries like the U.S. and other European countries in order to take targeted sanctions. What does she feel? Should we wait for other countries, or should Canada be prepared to go alone as we believe?
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that I answered this question earlier when I said that Canada should start to explore the possibility of starting to impose certain sanctions on those responsible for the situation. For example, freezing assets or preventing those people from traveling. Those are things that we can do ourselves without waiting for other countries. But certainly, in terms of other actions to be taken, we can discuss with like-minded countries, with our allies, to see what else can be done. But when it comes to certain targeted sanctions, Canada certainly can act alone as of now, if it wants to, and if we judge that that is what is necessary.
Short question. Questions and comments?